Hey everyone, Seth Marlowe here. Today we're going to be going over some trench rescue awareness. My overarching goal for us is to understand what the first due engine can do when they arrive upon a trench situation. And in order to do that, we need to understand what a trench is, recognize and mitigate hazards, know how to control the scene, learn how to assist with rescue operations, and then know where trench rescue equipment is actually located. So what actually is a trench? By the strictest definition, it's any hole that's deeper than it is wide that is also at least 4 feet deep. So typically we see this in something like utility holes that are dug. The reason the 4-foot depth is a requirement is because if it's less than 4 feet deep, then essentially we're not expecting anybody to really suffer any severe damage or get buried or not be able to self-extricate if there were some sort of collapse. The other thing we might see with trenches, once it is deeper than 4 feet, is some sort of protection put in by companies, especially if they're following OSHA standards. So in this case, this man's inside of a trench box, and that's something that we could see on scene. Contrary of that is there are going to be a lot of smaller mom and pop shops that might not put in the proper equipment and safety PPE. So there are times where people might even have shoring that's just some shovels that span the trench, and those might be what we're more likely to run a call on. So when we do run calls, there's essentially going to be collapse scenarios, and that's when the trench has given way, the dirt's been displaced, and it's actually buried somebody, some level or completely, or a non-collapse scenario, and that could be somebody's been struck by something above and they're knocked out below, or they've had a medical condition inside of a trench. And even in those scenarios, we still need to take precautions so that we know that we're safe entering and we're not going to suffer if something were to happen to that trench. Okay. So, as the first due engine arriving on scene, there's going to be some considerations. One of the first things that you're going to want to manage is any bystanders. As with any of these sort of intensive scenarios, people are going to try to get involved, try to help others, but a lot of times that can create a more dangerous situation or even create a second victim. So by getting those bystanders removed away from the trench, but also making sure that we're utilizing the information that they're able to provide, especially if they saw where the person went down and the person's now buried. Let's use that information, but let's get that bystander away from the trench initially, create a safe environment to actually move back towards the trench, and then use that information from there. In order to analyze the trench safely, let's do a little top-down bird's eye view. So if we've got these end walls of the trench, the safest way to approach is always going to be from these corner angles, okay? We're going to want to use that to look for our victim initially if we're unsure where they are. Now, especially in a collapsed trench, so let's say right here is where the dirt gave way and we don't know where our victim is. We definitely do not want to approach from where it collapsed. And equally important is a lot of times the trench is going to kind of mirror. So approaching from just the other side of where it collapsed is also extremely dangerous. We also want to consider some of the things I mentioned earlier, like any surcharge that's put on by, let's say, our dirt pile. So this is our dirt pile right here. If we were to go over there, we're adding to weight that's already pushing on the trench, as well as any vehicles that are acting on the trench. So overall, we want to avoid any of those areas where we have vehicles, the spoil pile, if there's any fissures we're seeing, so splits in the ground, anything like that is going to be a no-go for approach. As the first due engine, when you do arrive, you want to know where those are so that you can communicate that, and then once the rescue arrives, we're going to be able to actually put down lit bridges that will span and distribute weight so that we can approach accordingly and actually look over into the trench. Now, as the first due engine arriving, let's say that there wasn't a collapse, and actually even if there was, you're going to want to drop 2 ladders into the trench from both sides. So ladder down just a little bit, and then maybe 25 feet up with our potential location of the victim in between, drop another ladder. This is so that if anybody were to fall in, or let's say our victim's able to self-extricate and make their way to the ladder, we're going to let them go out that way. Anytime we're working in something deeper than 4 feet, we need 2 ladders there, even if the trench isn't compromised at all. Those ladders can also be used, especially if you have extra ones, to put along the side of the trench just as a way to distribute weight until we can actually get down some ground pads or, as mentioned, those lip bridges. So all of this is just ways to safely look and evaluate the trench and gather some more information, look at where your patient potentially is, try to assess the patient and understand what's going on with them, if they are able to talk or communicate, or if you are able to see any of the injuries, and provide more as everybody's arriving on scene. Now that we understand how to approach the trench appropriately, we can dive a little deeper into controlling the scene. So the number one thing is going to be removing any people involved in the scene. So any bystanders, we need to get them to a safe location, and that includes people who might be in the dozers nearby or anybody who's actually gone inside the trench to try and help out. So as mentioned before, if people are inside the trench trying to help, we need to get ladders in and pull them out, but also be sure that you're noting where they're digging, because chances are they're going to their last seen point. Once they're out and in a safe location, we can ask them about that, and when we do have what we believe to be patient location, be sure to mark it with a cone. We also want to make sure we secure the entire scene so that nobody's able to enter from there. So we can do this using caution tape, or if we have law enforcement available, let's make sure that nobody else is able to come and get close to the trench, add more weight, or disturb our operation overall. The important questions to ask as we interview those bystanders, once we get them to a safe spot, is how many patients, and looking at that patient location. Something else we can do when we're actually looking into the trench is try to note if there's any tools, maybe like any drinks, like a Monster Energy just sitting around. Those could be little indicators if we don't have other knowledge to go off of as to where they could have been at that time. There's a few things that we can assess for the collapse potential. So let's imagine for now that we are now inside the trench. So this is me standing at that end wall we talked about, looking straight down the trench. This is a wall vertical, just like I'm standing down here in this trench. A few different things that might happen with the trench is you could have an undercut, and this one's tough to see if you were to be approaching from this angle, because it means that the dirt broke away at the bottom here and is probably sitting down here now. If we're standing above that, there's major potential for everything up here to break away and fall into the trench. So undercuts are something to look for. You could also have fissures, so this would be more noticeable above ground. Any cracks or splits that are happening near the trench up at the top of the ground. So it's here, starting to split about yay far out. We want to make sure that we're definitely staying at least however far this is away. Let's say it's 2 feet. We want to remain that distance away from the trench if at all possible, because that's going to be at the greatest risk of sloughing away. We also want to look for bulges. So instead of where we had that undercut, we now have a bulge. So it could be a potential water buildup or just something's exerting force to where this is wanting to give way. And similarly, even if the trench really doesn't look like much is going on, but we have little rocks starting to fall, break away, any sloughing, raveling, stuff like that, then we know that this is at risk of giving way in that moment. Once you arrive on scene, you're going to want to be aware of any trench hazards that might exist. As mentioned earlier, a lot of times these trenches are created for utilities, so you could have exposure to wires, gas lines, anything of that nature. And in order to address that, you might want to reach out to Excel, potentially use a gas clamp kit if appropriate, but you definitely do want to start some air monitoring into the trench, especially in a situation where you see a patient and it's a non-collapse trench and they're at the bottom. If it's kind of unknown what's going on, start the monitoring. It could be a result of some of that hazardous atmosphere. Additionally, if there is excess water, even if it's raining or just super wet deep down inside of the trench, we're going to need to do some dewatering operations because it's going to be super difficult. It's going to contribute to potential future collapse, and these are all things that we're going to need to address and mitigate as we're moving through the actual operation. Then the two other things we want to talk about is spoil pile and equipment. And so when I say spoil pile, that means the actual dirt that's been removed from the trench and is then placed elsewhere. The closer that is to the trench, the more load that's going to be exerted on the actual trench itself, which is what can contribute to a collapse. So ideally we want any spoil piles at least 2 feet away, is OSHA standard, but in any situation, the more we can get anything heavy that's exerting force onto the ground and potentially influencing a collapse, further away the better. With that is the same for equipment. Any dozers or anything that's being used to dig that trench nearby, if it's right at that lip, again, it's going to be exerting a lot of weight that we don't want acting on that trench. So if you arrive on scene and you've got an operator still in it, let's have them move away as quickly as possible or disable, lock out, tag out that vehicle once it's far enough away.